Okay, so new reading now. Employee compensation, post-employment and share-based compensation. The reading is in a way divided into two larger parts. So, employee compensation. The first part is the post-employment benefit, and second part is the share-based compensation. Post-employment benefits would mean what benefits you promised your employee once the retirement period gets over, and share-based compensation would mean issuing your employee an instrument like, let's say, ESOP, employee stock option plan, or option grants. This post-employment is further divided into three parts: defined contribution plan, defined benefit plan, and the healthcare plans. And share-based compensation would typically have components like ESOPs or share grants or components like phantom stocks, about which we'll discuss further. Do you remember what was defined contribution plan? What was defined contribution? Yes, correct. That employee, yes. So every month an employer would make a contribution. The contribution is defined, and then it would be the responsibility of the employee to invest that smartly enough so that that money grows and generates sufficient amount of retirement portfolio for him. So the accounting for defined benefit plan is going to be really smooth. Whatever is the contribution made, that contribution is considered as expense. There is no asset that needs to be created. There is no liability that needs to be created. Okay, so straightforward set of calculation. Whatever contribution we would be making is an expenditure, no asset, no liability. In case of defined benefit plan, an employer would give a promise to the employee that after your retirement, till the time you live, every month you would be given X amount of pension. And it is the responsibility of the employer to ensure that he generates sufficient amount to take care of pension liability. So in defined benefit plan, in this reading, we would be focusing on what is the economics behind the defined benefit plan, and what is the accounting which is behind these plans. And accounting, again, different treatment in IFRS and US GAAP. Okay. So as far as economics is concerned, this is a simple TVM problem which should not be very difficult to master. However, we would have to spend significant amount of time understanding how to account for this particular plan in US GAAP and IFRS. And then remaining parts are going to be relatively easy. Generally, there are no assets created for healthcare plans, and therefore we won't be spending a lot of time on this. And these would be relatively again similar. This section will have good linkage to your derivative syllabus of CFA Level 1, okay, which you have already gone through, like impact of volatility on option pricing and those kind of questions, so which should be a smooth ride. So for us, if we take care of this part of the reading, if you remember what component is to be treated how in US GAAP and IFRS, employee compensation should be a smooth ride. Should we start? So let's build a hypothetical example. Let us say you've recruited a new employee. You have promised him an annual salary of 100,000. The expected working life of this employee, let us assume, is 25 years. You expect that his salary every year will grow. So annual compensation growth rate, let us say, of 10% is too much, 3%. The pension that we have promised him is last salaried on into 2% into number of years of completed service. You expect that he would live for 15 years post retirement. and discount rate is 10%. Now see this problem carefully. It's a defined benefit case scenario. You recruit a new employee with an annual salary of 100,000 right now. You expect that he would work for you for 25 years. Every year that he works, his salary is going to grow, and it is going to grow at the rate of 3%. So this was your first assumption. Then this was again an assumption that you expected salary would grow by 3%. It might grow faster or slower than what you have assumed. This is a fact, or this is your pension scheme. Okay, so this is not an assumption. This is what you have promised him, that your last salary into 2% into completed service. He would live for 15 years post retirement is again an assumption. And this discount rate is typically the yield on the corporate bond of the company. Okay, so however, again, you need not know this for your examination, but you can just have it somewhere in your notes that this discount rate is typically what is the yield on the corporate bond of the company. Now what we need to do is we need to find out that what is the amount of liability that is vested towards this employee at the end of year 1 because of this particular pension promise. Are you following this? So on a time value timeline chart, this is day 0, this is day 25, this is where your employee retires. After retirement, we have promised him, or we are guessing that he would live for 15 years, and every year we will pay him an X amount of pension. And how do we calculate that X? First we calculate his last salary. We multiply the last salary with 2%. However, right at the year 1, you would not assume that number of years of completed service is 25. Because only if employee works for 1 year, you're not going to pay him pension which is worth 25 years. So that number of years of completed service will increase as he works for more and more years. So at the end of year 1, when we want to calculate a liability, that number of years of completed service would be 1. Then in year 2, number of years of completed service would be 2, so on and so forth, and that is how the amount of liability every year will keep on increasing. Are you following this? Yes? So let's first calculate what is the last salary that he is going to draw from this organization. Now tell me, if his working life is 25 years, how many increments can he expect? 24. Right? So let's calculate the last salary. Second clear TVM, 100,000 present value, 24N, 3 IY, compute future value. 203279. So about 200,000 is the salary that we are offering him. Once we know what would be his last salary, and I'm writing the calculations here, present value was 100,000, N was 24, and IY was assumed to be 3. We computed the future value. Then step number 2 for us is find out the last salary into 2%, which is what we have promised him, into, since he's worked for 1 year as of now, so multiplication factor of 1. So find out 2% of this value. 4065. Okay, so let's keep it as 4065, which means every year the amount that we have promised him is 4065. And as of now, we are thinking that he would be taking 15 such payments from us post retirement. Third step would be, can we estimate the value of liability on year 25 using these 15 payments? So value of liability in year 25, how would you calculate this? You would keep your payment as equal to 4065. You would keep your N as 15 because we are assuming he is going to withdraw 15 payments. And now the discount rate that we would be using is 10%. And you have to compute the present value. Can you tell me how much is that? 37? 9? 23. Okay, so 30923 is the amount of liability that we, or the amount of money that we need to have on year 25 so that it is sufficient enough to take care of remaining 15 payments. Are we together on this? Once we know how much he needs on year 25, can we take a present value and find out how much is that worth today, which is at the end of year 1? So value of liability today, which we have assumed to be year 1, would be payment of, in fact, future value of 30923, N of 24 and IY of 10, which is how much? 9? 3139. So this is the amount of liability that we have today. And this amount of liability that we have today, this we called as PBO, present benefit obligation. Have you understood the mechanics? From step 3 to step 4. See, step 3 liability was 30923, which was your liability at year 25. So in year 25, if you have 30923, then that amount would be sufficient to take care of remaining 15 payments. If you have those 15 payments. Yes. So if you have 30923 at the end of year 25, this amount is sufficient to make 15 payments of 4065. So how much is that equivalent to today's liability at the rate of 10%? So we just discounted it for 24 years at the rate of 10%, and that gave us 3139. Okay, so what it means is, in a hypothetical scenario, imagine if these assumptions that you made were actually true in real life. What the organization should do is open up an investment account, invest 3139 in that account. If that amount grows at the rate of 10%, by the end of year 25, the organization will have 30923, and that 30923 would be sufficient enough to make 15 payments of 4065. Pension liability would be taken care of. Is that clear? Now, what changes if we want to find out the liability at year 2? If we need to find out what would be the liability, what would change is, now here the multiplication factor was 1. For year 2, the multiplication factor would be 2, because he's completed 2 years of service. So 4065 into 2, these would become your payment, and you take a present value, and of course that present value would be double this amount. Correct? So it has to be, because there is a multiplication factor of 2, the present value would be double of this amount, which would be how much? 61846. Double of this value would be 61846. And this 61846 we will discount now for how many years? 23 years. Isn't it? Because we are discounting backwards now to find out liability at year 2. So find out what should be the liability at the end of year 2. 6906. All of you have got this? Now understand this carefully. I'm making a very important point. We can clearly see that your liability has increased at the end of year 2. In fact, let's also get year 3 liability to build a better perspective. Multiply 30923 into 3, 30923 into 3, and take present value for how many years? 22 years. $11,396. Okay. So we can clearly see every year the amount of liability is increasing, and it has to increase because, and it is increasing for 2 reasons. And listen to this carefully. What are those 2 reasons? Number 1 is the time value of money. Even if the employee wouldn't have worked for 1 more year, the liability would have still increased, because today's 3139 only for employee working 1 year, by in 25 years has to become 30923. Are you following this? So because of time value of money, liability will keep on increasing. Another reason why liability is increasing is because instead of multiplication factor of 1, we use multiplication factor of 2, or we use multiplication factor of 3 in the year 3. So liability every year will increase, number 1 because of interest cost, and number 2 because employee worked for 1 more year. So the interest component is of course called interest as it is, and that portion of the liability which increased because employee worked for 1 more year, that we call as service cost. So every year your PBO, which is present benefit obligation, which is a liability, will increase on account of two front. At minimum, one is the interest cost, other one is a service cost. Now please find out the difference between 3139 and 6906. The difference between 3139 and 6906. How much? 3767. We know that this increase has to be made of two parts. One is interest cost, other one is service cost. Interest cost is easier to find. Whatever was my opening liability into 10%, that is my discount rate. That means 3139 into 10%, I am simply writing this number as 314. Is it fine? How do I estimate what was the service cost? Service cost is that cost, that increase in my pension liability which is occurred because employee worked for 1 more year. Because employee worked for 1 more year, instead of multiplying with 1, we multiplied with 2. That means every year we paid him 4065 extra, and the present value of this 15 extra 4065 at the end of year 2 should be the service cost. Should I repeat again? Because employee worked for 1 more year in year 2, we said number of years of completed service is 2. So in the earlier case, if he had worked only for 1 year, we would have paid him a pension of 4065. But now we are paying him double the pension, 4065 into 2. That means that additional 4065 that we are paying him every year, present value of that 15 additional 4065 today should be the service cost. Are you following this? So let's find out how much is that worth. Okay, one step we've already done, but I'm going to make you do that again. Second clear TVM. 4065 is the payment. 15 is N. 10 is IY. Compute present value. 309. Oh, this was 18, is it? Fine, fair enough. So let's say it is 30923 or 30920. This is the additional liability because he worked for 1 more year. How much is the value of that additional liability at the end of year 2? So discount this additional 30923 for 23 years backwards. 3452. And now take a total of these values, 3452 and 314. The total will come to 3767. So every year your liability will increase. One component would be interest cost, which would be nothing but previous opening liability into the discount rate. Second component would be service cost, which is addition to the pension discounted till today. Is it fine? So please write this down. Done writing?